Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. D.V. Prasad from Indira Gandhi National Tribal University, Amarkantak. Today we will discuss the module Peasant Movements from paper Indian Anthropology. Let us see what we are going to learn from this module. We will discuss about peasant movements in colonial India, peasant movements in the era of nationalist struggle. The imposition of colonial regime in South Asia led to varied responses from different sections of the subcontinental society. The colonial states bid to impose new revenues apparatus based on strict assessment, and their proclivity to rack rent led to veritable crisis in agrarian economy that threatened both the traditional elite as well as peasants. While the relationship between these two sections had traditionally far more harmonious. In the early 19th century, this new order more often than not led to their joining hand to resist the changes that were threatening to dissolve most of the institutions their ancestors had taken for granted. Consequently, most of the peasant rebellions of the first phase of the colonial government were aimed at restoring the old order of things. Early peasant rebellions, most of the peasant rebellions during the first century of the British rule may be bracketed under what Kathleen Gow has characterized as restorative rebellions. Most of the rebellions were initiated by dissatisfied and dispossessed elements of the older regimes that were crumbling slowly but steadily under the assault of new colonial revenue machinery. While it is true that in most instances the leadership was provided by the older landed gentry, rich and middle peasants, as well as landless peasants, took active part against what was perceived as an external enemy, threatening the entire traditional agrarian order. And the first rebellions of this kind were led by Raja Chet Singh of Awadh in 1778-81. Though this rebellion was suppressed swiftly, trouble continued for many decades to follow. Similarly, in 1842, Bundela Rajput chieftains rose up in revolt under similar circumstances. The trouble was not continued to North India. In South Madras Presidency had to grapple with rebellions in the Tirunelveli district. Here, local chieftains called polygars could mobilize the support of broad sections of the peasantry against new regime. Their legitimacy was embedded in the peasant consciousness to the extent that even after being vanquished, they managed to retain a place in the popular memory as local folk heroes and kept inspiring subsequent generations of rebels. Another rebellion that rocked the Madras province was that Velu Tampi, the Diwan of Travancore. British response to these rebellions was not uniform. In some instances, efforts were made to cope up the dissatisfied sections of the rebellious gentry, but in an overwhelming number of cases, they resorted to brutal suppression. Kathleen Go notes that in such instances, the tactic adopted by colonial government was to make example of the captured rebels by punishing them so brutally that a firm message of terror may be conveyed to all potential rebels contemplating rebellion, though the above mentioned rebellions were led by traditional elites. In some instances, peasants organized themselves on their own accord against what they believed to be breach of moral economy by the new regime. Before institution of permanent settlement in Bengal, the countryside was being led to waste by dissolute revenue farmers. Peasants at Rangpur raised the standard of revolt against the exploitative colonial revenue apparatus. The newly established colonial state was extremely hostile to numerous wandering communities, which were looked upon by it as disruptive and potentially criminal. Modern states dislike itinerants because they are almost impossible to tax and also defy the cherished ideal of modern states to ensure regularity, uniformity, and efficiency in administration. Therefore, since its very inception, the colonial began to take steps to curb the autonomy and mobility of such communities. The sannyasi are and fakir rebellions that rocked North Bengal and parts of Bihar in the last 2 decades were partly a result of the conflict worldviews as outlined above and partly as a result of the massive famine in the region 1769 to 70. Though this rebellion was eventually suppressed, similar conflicts arising out of the colonial states' distrust of wandering communities remain a recurring feature of the 19th century and partly also the first half of the 20th century. In most of these peasant rebellions, religion had a very important role to play. In pre capitalist, pre modern societies, conceptual categories like class or nation were non existent. The category of political too, in its modern sense, was absent. In such context, economic, political, and social were fused together into an indistinguishable whole, and religion and community were the predominant paradigms within which the peasants made sense of oppression or conceptualized resistance. It is for this reason that in almost all the major peasant rebellions of this period, religious idioms predominated the language and symbols deployed by rebels. Most of these rebellions were marked by a spirit of egalitarianism conceived within a religious worldview. Some other features are messianism and millenarianism. Often these movements were led by some charismatic leader thrown up from among the ranks of these peasants, endowed with supernatural powers and bearing a divine mandate to build the society anew. It is not uncommon for these charismatic leaders to awake a golden past when everything was just vis a vis the corruption and oppression of the present. To fight and strive for justice then becomes not merely a matter of economic necessity, but a divine ordained moral duty. These elements are unmistakable in the rebellions led by Karim Shah and his successor Tippu Shah in East Bengal. Titu Mir's rebellion against the local jamindars and Haji Sharaitullah and Dudu Mian's rebellions in East Bengal. Malabar's Mopla rebellion too was similar to some extent. Though unmistakably religious in outlook, these peasant movements must not be confused with modern day communalism. Communalism, as understood in the South Asian context, is by nature pan, local, and modern. An entire community unified by a sense of common past, culture, density, and interest mobilizes itself. On the contrary, the peasant movement that we examined above were strictly local in outlook, and the sense of community too did not extend beyond the restricted geographical cultural areas where these movements were waged. Specific economic grievances, often fused with pre existing religious consciousness to give rise to a community based movement, but it would be anarchistic to treat these either as the prehistory of communalism or nationalism. The coming of colonial state marked a break from the pre-existing pattern in many ways. Jamindars were almost suddenly raised from the status of being co-sharers in the agrarian revenue to proprietaries of land, particularly so in the areas of permanent settlement. Peasants lost their customary right to occupy and were transformed into tenants at will. For a long time, the colonial government passed almost no laws to protect the tenants. Increasingly, vulnerability of the peasants contributed to rising peasants' militancy and resistance. Despite the establishment of police apparatus and courts, the local power of jamindars continued unabated, allowing them to impose several legal and illegal cesses. This, along with the new court apparatus, which due to several factors was almost always ranged in the favor of jamindars. The police, who appeared as petty oppressors to the peasants, and increasing penetration of money lenders with the creation of a land market under the colonial government, led to the creation of the unfamous Sarkar, Sahukar, and Jamindari nexus that was the target of peasant rebellion in the majority of the cases. The official colonial archives, these rebellions have been looked upon as spontaneous uprisings of Swedish, brutish savages resisting the onset of civilization. Nationalists, on the other hand, as we have seen above, have tried anachronistically to project these as the prehistory of the nationalist movement for liberation from colonialism. Among modern historians, there is a lively debate regarding their scope and nature. Subaltern historians have criticized the Marxist historiography for projecting these movements as being pre political and for presuming that these movements lacked a well formulated program, organization, and ideology. It has been argued that these early peasant movements cannot be condemned by us moderns for not charting the same path and taking recourse to the same process that we think they ought to have. Early peasant movements and their own independent sphere of what they considered political, and in most cases they displayed a well formulated worldview, ability to organize, and the vision of an alternative social order. So, the subaltern historians are not beside the point in stating that these rebellions cannot be considered merely reactive. But we still need to ask whether they had the potential to actually bring about the transformation that they were striving for. Despite all their preparation, worldview, and organization, as subaltern historians would themselves concede, most of these movements were local and territorial in nature, and probably the subaltern school would not object if one were to say that their conception of what constituted the political was not adequate for the purpose of taking on aggressor like the colonial government with its vast resources and global presence. For this early peasant movements to truly assume the character of political, they needed to spill over from the local context and assume the form of a universal resistance against the colonial state, because the overwhelming majority of these early peasant movements were unable to transcend the local and assume a universal form, probably from a definite perspective, at the pain of being called teleological by someone. One could probably call these movements pre political. Peasant movements, the second half of the 19th century. During the revolt of 1857, two peasants joined in to resist the new tax regime. This instance, though the colonial state had greater difficulty in restoring their control because its own soldiers too rebelled and were in fact the main force behind the rebellion. A vast majority of the colonial army was drawn out from among the peasantry and the agrarian discontent, along with a number of other factors, played a major role in instigating the rebellion. Particularly, the ruin of peasantry in Awadh had a direct bearing upon the morale and loyalty of the colonial native army. A vast majority of these peasants in uniform did not just rebel, but they also helped fan the rebellion by going back to their villages and utilizing their caste community ties to instigate the peasants to join the rebellion. This pattern of early peasant rebellions continued through the greater part of the 19th century. Despite the broad sweep of the rebellion in 1857, peasants' resistance had still retained its prior localized, disjointed pattern, though it cannot be denied that the rebels were conscious of a wide ranging concerted effort to throw out the colonial state, but their objective was not yield yet to be built a unified nation, state of their own. At best, this rebellion may be described as an attempt to go back to the decentralized polity of the 18th century. Moreover, though there were innumerable peasants uprisings in the course of rebellion, there was not yet a consciousness among them of belonging to a unified class ranged against the colonial state as a bloc over common grievances. Everywhere, mobilization was done through the local communities over grievances that were perceived at the local level. In the post 1857 period, as the British set about building modern institutions of governance, there were signs of change in the mode of protesting. In some instances, peasants began to use these new channels to seek redress through legal means. Moreover, in this new phase, when the colonial state began to set up institutional channels to connect with the masses, traditional rural elite increasingly began to seem out of sync with changed times. In other words, what was required now was a new type of leadership capable of representing the peasants in parliamentary legalistic manner. However, incipient these institutions might as yet be. Consequently, there were some beginning of new middle class participation in the peasant movement, and in some instances, these peasant movements throw up their own leaders to fulfill these rules. Indigo uprising in Bengal, in the district of Nadia, Mushirabad, and Pabna was one of the first uprisings in this sort, which tried to use legalistic means to gain redress against the practice of forceful indigo plantation. It had all the signs of modern form of protesting, the use of government institutions, petitioning, collective legal struggle, and appeal to the liberal opinion through the use of press. Deccan riots of 1875 were an uprising of an older kind, increasing commercialization of agriculture under the new regime and the creation of a market in land created opportunities for the new class of money lenders to penetrate the rural economy and assume control over land. Peasants resented this penetration of outsiders and indulged in rioting against the Marwari moneylenders. Post of the formation of Congress, for the first time, a platform was created for the coming together of localized and disjointed struggles in various parts of the country. Realizing the potential of peasant activism, gradually attempts began to be made to harness the force of peasant movements to the career of Indian nationalism. Despite vigorous attempts by various leaders, an obvious disconnect between the stated ideals of the nationalistic leadership and the objective of the peasant movement persisted. Some historians would argue till 1947 and even beyond. Peasant movements did break out during all the major movements launched by Congress leadership. But as the subaltern historians have argued that they have history of their own and they should not be looked upon as the prehistory of the freedom movement. Peasant movements in the era of nationalist struggle. With the rise and growth of the nationalist movement, there were attempts, mainly by leaders belonging to the middle class, to harness the energy of the peasant movements for the cause of the anti colonial struggle. During the Home Rule League movement, attempts were begun to organize the peasants in Kisan Sabhas. Congress leader Madan Mohan Malaviya rendered his support to Gauri Shankar Mishra and Indra Narayan Dwivedi, who played a leading role in setting up the UP Kisan Sabha in 1918. As there had been a pre-existing groundswell in UP, the Kisan Sabhas spread rapidly, and by June 1919 it had as many as 450 branches. In 1920, the Awadh Kisan Sabha came into existence, which launched radical tenancy right struggles and also raised voice against illegal taxes and forced labor. Early 1922, Eka movement raged in the UP districts of Harodi, Bahraich, Sitapur to protest against Jamindari oppression and high rents imposed by them on the land. Forced eviction of tenants and forced labor remained persistent issue for the peasants' outrage against Jamindars. Bardoli Satyagraha was started following outrage among peasants of the region against government decision in 1926 to increase the land revenue demand by 30%. The Congress leadership intervened and Vallabhai Patel arrived to assume the leadership of the movement. The Bardoli peasants decided to refuse the payment of revenue at the revised rates. Soon the movement became a national issue and the government, fearing its spillover to the other areas, decided to reach a compromise with the peasants. All India Kisan Sabha was founded in April 1936 with Swami Sahajananda as its president and N.G. Ranga as the general secretary. AIKS, though formerly allied to Congress, was by no means controlled by it. Though it had close relationship with the leaders of the Congress Socialist Party, a number of communist leaders too worked with it. Within a few years, it was able to spread its organization and build its mass base to the extent that it could even exert pressure upon the Congress Party to take up some of its demands. The IIKS and Congress held simultaneous sessions at Faizpur in 1936 and Congress manifest for 1937 provincial elections had strong reflections of the AIKS agenda. Soon, AIKS activities assumed a life of their own, and in most instances, it was almost impossible for the national leaders to control them from above. In Kerala's Malabar region, peasant unrest was extremely acute. A number of Congress Socialist Party activists, many of whom went on to join the Communist Party leader, were active in this region. As a result of which, a number of Karshak Sanghams came up and started agitations against landlords. The legacy of these anti-Jamindar movements survived for many years to come and helped break the back of probably the most organized and ruthless section of Jamindars in the subcontinent through the years of sustained movements. Similar anti-Jamindar movements continued in Andhra. The most influential peasant leader here and one of the founding members of the AIKS was N.G. Ranga. Militant peasant movement in this region gradually grew disillusioned with Congress leadership, which failed to endorse the most radical anti-Jamindar demands despite its stated intention to do so. As a result, soon the leadership began to pass into the hands of communists. Tebaga movement. In Bengal, the Flood Commission had recommended Tebaga two-thirds share to the Bargadars, the sharecroppers, instead of the existing practice of giving them one half share. In September 1946, the Bengal Provincial Kisan Sabha gave the clarion to enforce the Tebaga through militant mass movements. Communist cadres and sympathetic urban youth threw their lot with the sharecroppers and helped organizing them. The movement was particularly militant in North Bengal. Both Hindu and Muslim sharecroppers joined hands to fight against the state repression and Jamindari backlash. The movement, despite its extreme popularity, soon dissipated as a result of communal frenzy that gripped the masses in the wake of impending partition. In the East Bengal itself, the Muslim League was able to hijack the movement by adopting, appropriating communist slogans and giving a communal color to the anti Jamindari movement by dint of the fact that most of the Jamindars in East Bengal were upper caste Hindus. Telangana movement, the biggest anti feudal guerrilla struggle in the history of modern India, erupted in Telangana. At its peak, as many as 3 million peasants participated in it. As Sumit Sarkar puts it, the princely state of Hyderabad under Asaf Jah ki Nizams was marked by a combination of religious and linguistic domination by small Urdu speaking Muslim elite ruling over predominantly Hindu, Telugu, Marathi, Kannada speaking groups. Total lack of political and civil liberties, causes to form of forced exploitation by Deshmukhs, Jagirdars, Doras, that is, landlords, in the form of forced labor and illegal exactions. During the Second World War, the communists were able to build strong guerrilla base in Telangana area and began struggle around anti-feudal issues like excessive rent, forced labor, and wartime exactions of the colonial government. Armed with primitive weapons, peasants clashed with Rajakars, Nizam's allied corporation, and Jamindari thugs. Despite facing brutal repression, the movement refused to subside and the princely state's army was almost decimated. Starting from Nalgonda, the movement soon engulfed Warangal, Khammam, and reaching its peak between August 1947 and September 1948. In the course of police action by the Indian security forces, the movement was suppressed. But even in its suppression, it achieved much and set the tone for more anti feudal struggles in the post independence period. So, students, let us summarize what we have learned from this module. Peasant movements during the colonial period were a response to the two-pronged exploitation and oppression that the peasants faced at the hands of the imperialists and the indigenous landed elite. In the first phase of the colonial government, peasants generally threw in their lot with indigenous elite because, as outsiders who set about building the most comprehensive revenue apparatus that the whose appetite for ever increasing returns seemed to know no bounds. The colonist, colonialists appeared to be threatening the entire traditional order. However, in its latter phase, when the primary focus was of the colonial state shifted from realizing revenue to securing raw material, markets, and channels for investment, the alliance between the indigenous elite and the peasant, seen during the first phase, began to break down. The indigenous landed gentry increasingly seemed on the same side as the colonial state, and the former also learned to use the ruling apparatus set up by the latter to its advantage. Now, on the protests of the peasantry were generally seen to be directed at both in the equal measure. The Congress Party led anti colonial movement tried to channelize the peasants' anger to advance the nationalist struggle, but often due to their difference and to some degree due to their collaboration with the same forces that oppressed the peasants, they were not always able to inspire confidence among them. The peasant struggle maintained a fair degree of autonomy of action, will, and consciousness through the entire period of anti-colonial struggle. The end of the British rule in 1947 was a great leap forward for the peasants' movement, but it did not, at one stroke, solve all the problems, a fact that reflects in their continuation in the post independence. Thank you.